So let's start. So good evening, or well, good afternoon to some of you, and welcome to the Global Care Ethics Panel. So this event is organized by the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory at the University of Belgrade and its Solid Care Lab, which is a research unit at the Institute that is devoted to the study of philanthropy, solidarity, and care. My name is Marko Konjevic, and with my colleague Zona Zaric, have the great pleasure of guiding us through what will hopefully not be a very bleak discussion about some of the issues which we are confronting, and that the circumstances in which we are living now, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, has not triggered them. Certainly it has intensified some of the issues that we will be discussing today. So the idea behind this panel is triggered by this pandemic that we're all living in. So these circumstances, such as contagious diseases that we've been living in for more than a year now, obviously they don't stop at borders, and they present a danger to all people, regardless of our gender, our race, ethnicity, sexuality, class, and in very different ways. But it also links us through the potentials of infection and recovery, suffering and hope, living and dying. If it hasn't been obvious before for care ethicists, it has, but now as we were chatting a bit before we started, it seems that more and more people are paying attention to some of the things that care ethicists have been insisting for quite a long time now, for decades, in fact. And this is that human beings are very needy beings, vulnerable creatures who depend on one another for not only physical, but also for emotional care. This pandemic has also intensified various troubling inequalities, both in nation states and at the global level. So what would be the implications of recognizing this human neediness, vulnerability, independence in our moral deliberations? What might justice require in times of global crises, such as the one we have? And how do we take the ethics of care outside of the private sphere and use it to revitalize our commitments to equal moral worth and a livable life on a planet in what is really a crisis? So these are just very, very broad outlines of some of the things that we will be talking about today with our guests who have very generously agreed to join us and to share their thinking about some of these issues. So we have with us, and I'll completely randomly who appears first on my screen, I'll go in that order. So we have Fiona Robinson, who's a professor of political science at Carleton University in Canada. She's the author of The Ethics of Care, A Feminist Approach to Human Security, Globalizing Care, Ethics, Feminist Theory, and International Relations. And she co-edited a book called Feminist Ethics and Social Politics Towards a New Global Political Economy of Care. Her book, The Ethics of Care, A Feminist Approach to Human Security, won the University of Southern California's J. Ann Tinker Book Prize in 2014, and it was shortlisted for the Canadian Political Science Association's International Relations Book Prize in 2012. We also have Sarah Clark Miller, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy, Bioethics, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Penn State University in the US. Her research is situated within ethics, social and political philosophy, and feminist theory. In 2012, Sarah published a book called The Ethics of Need, Agency, Dignity, and Obligation. And currently she's working on two book projects, if I'm not mistaken, Sexual Violence and Sexual Agency, and the second one, Relational Ethics on the Meaning of Vulnerability and Interdependence for Moral Life. And we have also Guillaume Leblon, and you'll excuse me if I mispronounce some of the things. I do not speak a word of French, but Zona was gracious enough to help me. I hope I will pronounce everything correctly. So Guillaume is a professor of philosophy at the University of Paris-Diderot. Between 2015 and 2018, he taught at the University of Paris-Créteil, where he held the chair of practical philosophy, and at the University of Bordeaux-Montaigne before that. His work focuses on the question of social criticism. Specifically, he studied the limits that distinguish precariousness, exclusion, decent life, and normality. He's also a specialist in the thought of Georges Guillaume. And he's the author of the first book on this subject, Guillaume and the Human Life, published in French. He also focuses on Foucault and the question of norms. He's also the author of several books, such as Ordinary Lives, Precarious Lives, Social Invisibility, Inside, Outside, The Foreigner's Condition, What to Do with Our Vulnerability, and The End of Hospitality. These are all in French. Maybe someone will translate them for the English-speaking audience. So this event, Zona and I envisioned it as something less formal. We envisioned it as a discussion with and between our guests, and also between our guests and the audience. So we will have some time later on for a Q&A session. But we thought about starting by asking a general question to all of our guests. So as I mentioned, we all are aware that by the end of 2019, the coronavirus emerged in China and quickly spread throughout the world. And by some estimates by the World Health Organization, more than 160 million people around the world are or have been infected, and more than 3 million people have died. And this kind of this pandemic puts us in a somewhat paradoxical situation. On the one hand, it unites us in the sense that it makes it painfully clear that we are all vulnerable, independent, and interdependent beings, regardless of various morally arbitrary differences that exist between us. But it also separates us precisely because of our vulnerability and interdependence. We have been forced to distance ourselves from others, as we are now distant and doing this online instead of in person. So we had to retreat from social life and to prioritize care for ourselves and our near and dear, which narrowed our circle of moral concern. We were all concerned with staying healthy and our family members staying healthy, and we didn't put so much thought into other people. So the question that we thought might be a good general question to start with is, have we responded in this situation? How have we responded to these situations in which we found ourselves? Did we respond in a caring way or not? And what would you say would be a caring way to respond to such a crisis? So I'll start again with Fiona. You're the first one on the screen, so I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this event, and thank you for organizing it. I've been looking forward to it, and I think it's extremely important that we continue to share our views on good care at this time. So you start with an interesting question, a difficult question, as all of them are. Difficult to answer in a short way or in a general way, because I think there have been so many different kinds of responses and in so many different contexts. So I guess my answer would be yes and no in terms of answering the question, have we responded with care? I think the positive sides are that we've seen perhaps at what we might call the micro level or the level of the everyday, I think we've seen a lot of caring responses in terms of individuals and communities reaching out to one another. Small things like delivering meals, helping with groceries, driving people to vaccine appointments. Again, I say small things, but to the people involved, these are very important things. These are life-sustaining acts of care. And I think there has been a recognition, especially at the level of the everyday, that of our really close entanglements, right? That we're not all separate, that we really are closely interrelated, and that this kind of that there is a real need to reach out to one another. Also at the level of the everyday, as we might call it, I think we've seen some small scale transformation of gender relations within households, which are promising. Again, as I think I'll say throughout my answers, I think that a lot of the things we're seeing now, and you alluded to it also, Marco, are not things that are caused by the pandemic, but have been revealed as a result of the pandemic and perhaps exacerbated. And so the sudden switch for so many people to working from home, I think brought care work to the fore in a way that it could easily have been or has been hidden in the past. So I think we have seen at least a recognition of this, and this has been very promising. And to me, all these things represent what we might call cracks, or sort of challenges or decenterings in the structures of liberal individualism, neoliberalism, patriarchy, and as I said, neoliberal forms of capitalism. But I think that at the institutional level, this is where we've seen perhaps a less promising response, when in fact, this is where we really, really need to see the response. I think we've seen in many contexts failures, to be frank, in terms of the way institutions have responded and in terms of the creation of policy. And, we did start to hear the refrain, certainly in this country, and I think around the world, people sort of saying, we're all in this together. But in fact, are we? And I think that we need to find a way of talking about this sort of ethically that moves beyond just some sort of kind of sentimentalist universalism on one hand, and a very strong individualism on the other. And I still think we are seeing that individualism in terms of the way countries are behaving, and I'll talk about that later. And even when you see individuals who are anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers, we shouldn't really be surprised by that. That is a very strong individual response. So to me, what we need to do is try to find a new way of talking that is about relationality, which is about our embodiedness, our interdependence, the need for reflexivity, the need to place these issues in historical and current sociopolitical contexts, in order to try and address the clear problems that we need to address right now. So I hope that answered your question. And that a caring response, what that would look like, I think again would take account of context, so that we are able to recognize difference. Difference is important, right? The way we're differently located in this pandemic is important. But also our deep interdependence, which means that individualist responses are not going to work. I'll leave it there for now for others.
Thanks, Fiona. Yes, it did answer, and that was something that was actually when Zona and I were formulating this question that was on my mind. I don't know how it was in other countries, in Serbia at least. So last spring, elderly people who are older than 65 were under a curfew 24/7 for quite a long time, and even elderly people who live in care homes, they still cannot have visits or go out. So that was a kind of, but you know, even I help my elderly neighbors who couldn't go out because of the curfew to go grocery shopping or get their medicine and stuff like that. So thinking in the individual, you're absolutely right that we've seen at the individual level a lot of caring responses, but at a higher institutional level, there certainly have been huge failures. But I won't. I will give the floor to Sarah now. But I see Estelle has joined us, so I'll just.
Hello, I'm so
Hi.
sorry. I had the typical technical problem at the last minute, so I could not reach you either. So I was wondering, I was desperate, I was freaking out, but finally it worked. So here am I. Sorry, really.
We're glad you were able to join us and that you'd resolve the technical difficulties. That's one of the one of the drawbacks, I think, is technical problems, but a good thing that came out of it is that we can actually have people from different parts of the world. That's a good thing. So I'll just then very briefly introduce Estelle and say what we have been discussing. So Estelle Ferrarese has joined us. She's a professor of moral and political philosophy at the Picardie-Jules-Verne University. She's one of the leading figures in contemporary French reception of critical theory. She was a research fellow at the Mark Bloch Franco-German Center for Social Science Research in Berlin and a visiting professor at the New School for Social Research in New York, and an Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Fellow at the Humboldt University in Berlin. Some of her work include a book called The Ethics and Politics of the Public Sphere, Habermas and Discussion. What does it mean to fight for recognition? In French, and in English, The Fragility of Concern for Others, Dogma and the Ethics of Care, and an edited volume on the politics of vulnerability. So I'll just so the question that we started with, just to fill in Estelle, was thinking about the situation that we're in with the pandemic, whether we responded in a caring way, and what would be a caring way if we hadn't responded in a caring way. What would be a caring way to respond to this situation? But I'll give again, completely randomly as you're positioned on the screen, so I'll give the floor to Sarah and Estelle. I hope you can then pick up on the discussion and join in.
Great. Thanks so much, Marco. And Zona and Marco, first of all, thank you for bringing us together for this conversation. And I'm delighted to be here and talking about these important issues today. So I want to answer this question by doing what might be a slightly annoying philosophical move of thinking about the background conditions for the question itself. So I think, it is this amazing question that you've posed. All of the questions we received, I think were deeply thoughtful and also snuck like 12 questions into each question, which is, I think, the mark of some really comprehensive thinking. So I think there have been multiple modalities of response to the COVID-19 pandemic that we've seen, right? And I think this variety of responses has in part been driven by different forms of local ethos that governs response in pandemic crisis. The task of evaluating which responses have been caring and which have not, I find to be particularly difficult. I mean, with some key exceptions of things that are remarkably not caring. So as a philosopher and ethicist, I think part of my job here is to help us think about the background ethical conditions and the principles that help us to make sense of our current circumstances. So I'm going to approach the questions this way. So I think as your question and the comments you've made thus far and the comments Fiona just offered make very clear, the pandemic has really brought into strong relief different threads of relationality and interdependence. And I think we understand them and feel them now in a way we haven't perhaps for quite some time, in fact. The pandemic also has landed us in this complex kind of intersection of grief and trauma and care. And it's that complicated terrain that I've been trying to make sense of recently in my own work. There are a couple related concepts I think that are particularly valuable for coming to understand some of the varied responses we've seen in the pandemic. And I want to focus on I was going to do two, but I might only have time for one. I want to focus on what I've been calling moral precarity, which is related to a notion of moral vulnerability. And as a background term, kind of the notion of relational harm. So I think these help us capture both the increasing awareness of our vulnerability, dependence, and interdependence, as well as you've been talking about, that kind of turning away from that interdependence as we seek protection for ourselves and our loved ones. So one mode of response I'd like to highlight involves what I think is a particular kind of precarity and vulnerability. In addition to these ways in which we've grown acutely aware of our shared physical and psychological and emotional vulnerabilities and dependencies, and indeed our interdependencies. So I take that to be kind of the ontological mode or representation of such concepts. This crisis has also bestowed upon many of us an increasing awareness of what I will want to call our moral precarity, right? And so the extent to which we can be said to have responded in caring ways needs to be set against this backdrop of moral precarity and vulnerability. So what do I mean by this? By this, I mean to refer both to our individual positions as morally precarious, as well as the way in which this pandemic has helped us to see that not only do we as individuals occupy positions that are characterized in terms of precarity, but our relationships themselves are quite precarious. And I think a lot of this, to pick up on one thread that Fiona was talking about, we need to view a lot of this against the background of neoliberalism and neoliberalism's hazards, especially in the context of a crisis of care. So moral precarity, I think, arises in circumstances that we've been facing where fulfilling the responsibilities that we take to be central to our sense of identity proves circumstantially impossible without also incurring some kind of considerable loss or harm, right? So there's always a kind of moral remainder, we might say. And so when we're experiencing moral precarity, it becomes increasingly difficult and I think ultimately unfeasible to adhere to ethical principles that really comprise the core of our own personal integrity. This is one way of analyzing the circumstances we've been facing. Now, if we think about caregivers in particular, right, in the pandemic circumstances, in the context of neoliberalism, this is an experience that one can think about through the lens of something like a notion of moral injury, which you find both in the nursing literature and in, fascinatingly, in literature about combat experiences and war. When events turn more dire, as we've seen recently in the global pandemic, the true depth of moral injury, I think, as well as the distress that caregivers can experience emerges. And this distress is really one about not being able to care well for one's own. And it's excruciating, right? So hearts can be crushed when we face impossible dilemmas of care under these conditions of finitude, when we're really not equipped with any good choices. So the global health crisis we've been facing, I think, we have to note, of course, is it possibly created and sustained by neoliberalism. And it's, to my mind, the best recent example of the amplification of the crisis of care to levels that guarantee kind of seemingly unending moral injury. So what do I mean practically? Let me finish up by kind of giving a practical example. So think about caregivers across the globe who are faced with really unthinkable choices in the context of a pandemic that force the balancing of fiercely competing needs, right? So do you travel to visit your critically ill elderly parent in the hospital, risking exposure that other family members at home can't sustain? Do you ration attention to your child who's struggling, in my own case, this was with remote schooling, so that you can open up space in the schedule to help your students who are struggling online? Do you continue to care for a community in crisis, right? More broadly construed, when your own house is not in good order? Do you care for dear friends who are sick with COVID and struggling financially and deeply lonely? In this type of environment, when the amount of needs present so completely outstrips the finite capabilities that we have, we face unavoidable and excruciating apportioning of harm, right? To those whom we fully believe it is our responsibility to protect and keep whole. So we're faced with choices no one should have to make. And we feel very much the weighty culpability attached to the responsibility of harm distribution. So the final thing I'll say is that in such circumstances, I think we assume responsibility for that which is well beyond our control, right? And the governing myth that we're working with here is perhaps the most crushing, right? That if we were morally better, we could avoid tragedy for those we love. And I think those circumstances are largely what we've been facing, which is why I think it's difficult to fully analyze what caring responses are.
Thank you, Sarah. That was excellent. I think I agree pretty much with everything you say. So Guillaume or Sarah, did you have something to add? No. Okay, Guillaume. Then I give the floor or the microphone to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marco and Zona, for inviting me. It's very kind of you, and especially I know very well Zona. She's making a wonderful work also on this topic. So I would like to mention it. My answer will be very shortly, as Fiona argued, yes and no. So I will make perhaps the same kind of reflection. Yes, I would say at the beginning of a crisis, I think we could think that we had this caring attitude as a kind of strong answer, putting in light question of dependency, interdependency, and so on. And at a certain moment at the beginning, we had this feeling, I mean, that we were all equally vulnerable. The coronavirus was transboundary, so that every life could be hurt by it, exposed to it. That was, I think, our first experience. So that we are convinced that we are all precarious, that we are all exposed to the possibility of being affected by the virus. And humanity suddenly appeared as deeply vulnerable. Humanity was, in fact, vulnerability. But I think this was just a step in the process of a globalization of the virus. In reality, for me, it's more and more obvious now. We are faced more and more with a more differentiated perception of different forms of vulnerabilities. Of course, the fact that the virus runs every life, but no one can say that he or she is invulnerable, places us in the absolute obligation of a generalized care. By care, I don't only mean the medical care, but also the social care, including different functions of taking care of the people, of organizing strong answer to different kinds of needs, including, of course, needs for protection. So that a generalized net of protections in which we are at the same time dependent from one another and from institutions of medical and social care. And I think as soon as we have experienced the need of a caring attitude, of caring institutions, we also experienced at the same time that the function of care was not equally shared and distributed in our world. In fact, we experience the fact that the response to a common vulnerability strongly depends on policies of life that each country develops through institutions of protection. And in reality, these institutions of medical and social protection are themselves dependent on the quality of political life in a country, on the way for democracies. For instance, democracy is understood as a caring democracy. And it could be said, for example, in France, we had this discourse, also produced by our president, that the so-called premier de cordée, first of ropes, I think that's the translation, praised by the President Macron, has been replaced by the premier de corvée, so the first of corps. And suddenly everybody seemed to rediscover the social, political, and even philosophical value of care. The neoliberalism of generalized competition was for a time overshadowed by the solidarity of shared care. But it was, I think, the first time of our reaction to the crisis. At the second moment, I think the construction, in fact, of protection seemed to me that it was more and more tied with the reconstruction of old borders and also with construction of new boundaries. I mean, we have been unable to hold a global response in terms of care to the global vulnerability produced by COVID. Moreover, we have protected ourselves by reaffirming our national belonging to the detriment of any European and even more global solidarity. And so that will be my conclusion. We are the witnesses of the return of a kind of borders, a kind of boundaries between us and so-called us and so-called them, and the occasion of a truly experience of radical and democratic care is a little darkened by the experience of the return of boundaries. And I mean by boundaries, I mean also gender boundaries between and also racial boundaries between people who have a true work, so to call, and who can work staying at home as we can do now, and migrant workers who must go outside to take care of the people we are. So that this return of boundaries appears to me as a way of shadowing the function of the care.
Thank you, Guillaume. Estelle, I hope you were able to catch up on everything. So I'll give the microphone to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think I have catch almost everything. Maybe not the beginning of Fiona's presentation, but I think I got most of it. So my answer might be similar to some of the previous ones, especially because I think that the answer is, I mean, we responded in a mixed way to this pandemic, and what I mean by that is, on the one hand, we were stuck into care, into some forms of care work that were imposed to us because of the circumstances, and Sarah mentioned all we had to do to deal with our family members, our students, our neighbors, and things like that. So there was a kind of caring response that were, according to me, linked to a certain obligation to act in a completely limited and framed situation. But at the same time, what strikes me is, first, I would say a kind of moral fatigue that appeared very quickly. That is the fact that you could see, even in the smallest interactions, a kind of absence of scruples. I don't know if you have noticed that. Even during meetings, professional meetings, people had less and less, gave less and less importance to those small gestures of tact, of respect that normally goes without saying. You would have people just disappearing during a meeting, for instance, people who did not show up without even explaining what, all these little things that actually are so important, and it really belongs to ethics, even if it's not as important as big gesture of heroism, but still there's very something like care in that, taking care of the others, of the people we are interacting with. And very soon we could observe that there was kind of general fatigue. I mean, and it was something that was justified, or at least that people believed was justified, in the sense that it was because we were buried under so many constraints that we felt like, well, I cannot cope with more than that. I mean, I have to deal with an environment that is so complex. There are so many things I have to take care of, that this is enough. And there is, and this brought about a kind of self-preservation, which is exactly the contrary, the opposite of a caring attitude. I mean, at some point we had, or we thought we had, to preserve ourselves against the others. And so that's one point I would make. And the other one has to do with something which seems to be very ethical, very caring, but which has an effect which might be, well, ambiguous. One of the ethical responses you could see, and which is still growing to the pandemic, is the growing of ethical consumption. Okay, you had this tendency, which is becoming huge, to consume in small shops, to buy only local products. So you had this idea that actually being ethical, caring, was about consuming in a particular way, in a way that would respect nature, in a way that would respect small producers and things like that. And which is totally fine. I'm not saying that we should have got the way we used to consume, but then in a way, care and ethic was absorbed in a very significant way in these consuming practices. And this has effects. I mean, you can observe an ethics which is completely framed by the market. And this is something that must be observed and analyzed, because when the market mediates something, then change the whole logic. And so here is what is happening, according to me. I mean, we have less and less ethical concern when it in terms of face-to-face, which what I was talking about, tact and things like that. And well, but we acted ethically, or we thought we did, by consuming in a specific way. But then the whole ethics is is framed by the market, mediated by it, and then changed by it. And so maybe very briefly, what I would say about what would have been a caring response, I would say that maybe to generally care for people might have been to accept a certain responsibility we have, not to accept what was given as natural, as normal, as obvious in terms of responsibility. So we have a responsibility to think and to resist what was presented as responsibility by our governments and things like that. Not accepting to be squeezed between a certain responsibility toward our family members in a very defined, a very strict and limited way, and on the other hand, the spaces, because this is where we were. I mean, our responsibility was towards the spaces. We are not supposed to contaminate each other. I mean, why do we wear a mask? Well, I don't know if you do wear a mask in your countries, but in France we do, in the streets all the time. So when you wear a mask, what does it mean? That actually you are supposed to act responsibly toward people you don't know. Okay, that's the idea. So you are responsible toward the spaces on the one hand, and but for instance, there were also other responsibilities that were actually completely hidden. The fact that, well, normally, especially during the first lockdown in France, we were not authorized to bury the people we loved. It was very, very complicated. We were not authorized to go to hospital, something like that. So there was this idea that actually what truly matters were the spaces, the survival of the spaces, people you don't know, just human beings, which is great, but that was at the cost of our responsibility towards people we truly loved. Okay, so there was this kind of a regime of evidences about who was vulnerable to which responsibilities we were supposed to assume. And I would say that being caring and having a caring response would have been to deny, maybe to question those obvious replies that was imposed to us by our governments, discourses, politics, etc.
Thank you, Estelle. Thanks to all of you for the first question. So for the audience, this was our first question that was intended for all our 4 speakers to answer. And then we have prepared 2 each, more personalized, so to speak, questions for our speakers related to their works. And then we will close off with another general kind of normative question before we open the floor for your questions, for anybody from the audience who would like to ask a question. So the first question is for Estelle, because it's about a notion that is the one that comes up the most during the pandemic. And as I mentioned, we had a reading workshop at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory of Belgrade on the topic precisely the ethics and politics of care. And one of the assigned readings was an edited volume by Estelle and the chapter on vulnerability. So you're guessing the notion we most discussed about was fragility, vulnerability, precarity. Philosophically also, what do they mean? Why is it important to differentiate them? And how come that it's coming up more now in different disciplines and not even between researchers than before? So that leads me to my first question for Estelle, and that is, what is the difference between fragility and vulnerability? Because in your work, you do elaborate on the importance of that difference, and it made me correct the way I use both words as well. So if to live is to be exposed, and for some exposed much more than others, as we've seen throughout the debate and what you have evoked, how can we think from this exposure? How can we recognize that it's not an exclusive attribute of certain subjects, and at the same time avoiding a kind of trivial universal vulnerability or fragility that we all have in common, that of our human condition, that we are doubly exposed to death and others? Can giving consideration to vulnerability lead to more than just ethics? Can vulnerability become the object of an ethics and a politics? And can vulnerability fully think the political beyond simply the need to respond to emergencies or to violent forms of injuries?
Thank you. So there are huge questions, so I will try to be brief. Well, I make a difference between fragility and vulnerability just in order to have an operative tool, I would say. I don't think that, I'm not trying to pretend it's the best way to use both concepts, just that I needed to make clear for myself, what I had in mind when I was talking about vulnerability. So I make this difference between what I would call a kind of uncertain maintaining of life, and this I call it fragility. For instance, the fact that our organs can just, I don't know, vanish or dissolve or something like that. And on the other hand, vulnerability, and because there is this idea of injury inside, at the root of the word vulnerability, vulnus. So I tried to put in that word the idea of being exposed to the other. And so I define vulnerability as a being at another's mercy. That's my definition of vulnerability. So a vulnerability arises, according to me, always as the other side of a power to act or a power not to act. That would be the answer. The point is not to say that those two concepts are completely different. The idea is that there is obviously a kind of continuum, and very often it's not easy to understand if what is happening to you at the moment can be called or should be called fragility or vulnerability. I mean, why are you? Your organs are fragile in the sense that they can be destroyed by a disease that might be socially produced, and you can get a cancer because actually you were exposed to certain kind of metal while working, so it's very complicated to make the difference. But what I have in mind here is the fact that there is something, by being vulnerable, I mean that we are exposed to someone else's gesture or lack of gesture. That's the idea. So there is always also, and this is the idea, a kind of moral evaluation that comes with the idea of vulnerability. That is the fact that when we talk about vulnerability, we are implying that somewhere someone should do something in order to prevent a disaster or something. What we hope will not happen. So there is a moral evaluation, and it entails an horizon of obligation that can be fulfilled or not. That's another question. In general, what I try to do when I use this idea of vulnerability is to plea for the fact that there's no point in trying to assess if our vulnerability is mostly constitutive or is mostly social and differentiated. I would say this is not the point, and a lot of discussions is going into that direction. But I would say, so what? Is it the most appropriate way of dealing with the problem? It's not because we are going to isolate what would be perfectly natural, what would be completely unavoidable, and what is completely socially produced and totally avoidable, that we are going to produce a tool that would be politically useful. I prefer to think about vulnerabilities using the plural, and the way those vulnerabilities make system. This is what interests me. That is the fact that you have like a huge number of vulnerabilities that are organized one within another, and that actually one kind of vulnerability can trigger another one, or can be chosen over another one, etc., etc. So, for instance, in the case of the pandemic, the physical vulnerability of some person, let's say the elderly, triggers or justifies the political vulnerability of others. Well, all of us, because in the end we all found out that we were vulnerable to more or less arbitrary decisions of the state. We had forgotten that while living in democracies, but finally we found out that actually we could be stripped of most of our rights from one day to the other. Okay, so we have this idea of this idea of vulnerability as actually something that never works alone. It's always, I mean, as I said, a kind of a system, and very often trying to reply to one form of vulnerability will trigger other form of vulnerability, and also or one form of vulnerability will reinforce another one, etc., etc. So my point is that actually it's not very useful to try to distinguish between constitutive vulnerability and social one, but we should much more see how all those vulnerabilities work together. So then the second group of questions is very complicated, and I guess that I don't have much time, but yes, of course, vulnerability can become the object of an ethics. Well, that's, I think I don't have to argue for that, it's obvious, especially because I said that according to me, the very use of idea of vulnerability presupposes a moral evaluation. So starting from that, it's ethical from the beginning. But about the political aspect, I would respond very briefly, because I have already in my first. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Are you all?
We all hear you very well. The sound and the picture are very good.
Okay, I go on. I'm not sure. Okay. Yeah. So what I again?
We still hear you. It's uninterrupted for us.
It's frozen. My screen is frozen.
But we still hear you.
Hello?
We hear you just fine. I'll let you know if something happens to the sound, so don't worry about the screen.
Okay. Yeah. So I was just, I will try to conclude here. The fact that actually vulnerability, as I said, is always something that has to be observed as framed into a discourse of moral obligations, and that vulnerability does not exist per se, as I tried to say, but is always something that is the result of discourses that might have been just given as obvious. There is a political element here that has to do with the possibility and the necessity we are in to question the evidences that exist in a society, but what counts as a vulnerability, which kind of priority we can imagine between the different vulnerabilities, which kind of vulnerability, for instance, should be addressed as a kind of something that would be bearable, for instance, for an individual, and what is not. So there is also a matter of threshold about the bearability of vulnerability, etc., etc. So there is an intrinsic political aspect of vulnerability that is to do that, because it is first and foremost a moral evaluation. Talking about vulnerability is first and foremost a moral evaluation. It is a moral discourse, and those discourse have to be put to the test, and this is very critical. Thank you. Hope you have heard, because, well, I've lost you at some point, but yeah, okay.
Thanks, Estelle. Yeah, there were no interruptions on our side, so we heard you. So now I would turn to Sarah, because you're also working on vulnerability. In fact, you're now working on a new book on relational ethics and the meaning of vulnerability and interdependence for moral life. So what are your ideas about vulnerability? Is there a single meaning of a vulnerability, as or are there many? And can vulnerability provide us with a foundation for an ethics of care? I'm purposefully asking this since in your previous work you mentioned, you emphasized needs, and at least as I read different early care ethicists, it seemed to me that the idea of human needs was something that united different early care ethicists, although you do depart from them in your previous work, in the sense that you connected with Kantian dignity, which earlier exponents has tried to avoid. But so the question would be, what is vulnerability? How can it provide us with a foundation for an ethics of care, and what is its relation to human needs?
Thank you, Marco. So yeah, I mean, in that earlier work, in the ethics of need, I really drew on the centrality of needs, as you're noting, for care ethicists, and tried to take that conversation that was happening among care ethicists and bring it into connection with some of the conversations happening in analytic ethics, people who did not understand themselves to be care ethicists, that were really talking about need as well, right? And so I wanted to see what could be made of the connection there. I do still think need is quite important. In that book, it really was in some senses, I consider it still to be a triggering event for care. And part of what drove my work back then, and still does to some extent, is just this general fascination with the ways in which others' needs have normative force in some way, right? So we feel, in a couple different ways, right? We feel compelled to respond to those who are in need, but we also sometimes feel repelled by the burden that arises in the face of need. And so although I work in analytic ethics now, I trained originally in phenomenology, in German and French phenomenology. And so what I wanted to make sure was accounted for was a very strong sense of embodied need and looking at ways in which phenomenology would be relevant too. So, I mean, from that work, I've moved forward, and what I think is maybe, I'll offer what I think is most fascinating for this particular conversation. While I do still think vulnerability is important, and I'll say why in a bit, I actually think that vulnerability is not foundational for care ethics in the way that dependency is. And this is, I think, a debate that's happening within feminist ethics circles in a number of different ways. So I land on the side of dependency, and I'll talk through a bit why I think that's the case. And this is a very, active place of discussion. So in the book, I'll also say a bit about that. In the relational ethics book, what I'm really trying to do there, where I offer this view about dependency being kind of more morally primary than vulnerability, I'm trying to, in essence, articulate the fundamental significance of relationality for morality, which when I say it out loud sounds pretty big. So I'm just going to stick with that, but that's what the book's trying to do. I'm trying to argue that relational ethics is a distinctive moral theory, and that really it's one that's characterized by this attribution of moral value, not to individuals or to collectives, but instead in light of these interactive, interdependent properties that can be held between persons. So that's a lot of what I've been working on in that manuscript as I move forward with it. And I demonstrate this by taking on some key notions within analytic ethics, such as dignity and harm, the concept of moral considerability, and I articulate how these all function relationally and what that means. So that's sort of what's happening there. So it's both meta-ethical and normative. So, I mean, I want to recognize, in talking about vulnerability and dependency and the relationship, I want to recognize and first emphasize the importance of vulnerability for moral life, and note that the work that's been done on vulnerability in multiple circles is an absolutely consequential step forward, right? So our sociality renders us mutually vulnerable to one another. I can injure you just as you can injure me. We also share an ontological form of receptivity, I think, that opens us to a wider range of experiences and affects that can be delivered on us by others and by the external world. So not just negative, but positive affects too. The fact of this mutual vulnerability, however, I don't think it provides a reason why we are responsible to one another and why we must care for one another. So why is vulnerability then, in my mind, ill-suited to be a foundation for moral responsibility? I think, in short, and to condense it for this particular format of roundtable discussion, I think protection in light of all of our vulnerability is really not all that we require, right? So imagine, if you will, for a moment, a world in which we're completely protected from injury, which sounds particularly good right now, I think, in the midst of a pandemic. In that world, amazing as it would be, we would still perish if our fundamental needs were not met, right? So injury represents one really significant aspect of how our lives can crumble, but it's not going to be the full picture. I think when protection in the face of vulnerability fails and we're injured, and when we are needy because no one is there to meet those needs, we occupy the same position. And that position is one of dependency, right? So to my mind, then, the most foundational component of our human existence is not our vulnerability, but rather our dependency. When we're injured, when we are needy, we require the same thing. What we require is care. And it is the interdependence of our lives that provides that care. So there are kind of two other ways to put this, and then I'll wrap up. So vulnerability, I think it fails to adequately serve as a foundation of moral responsibility, not only because it doesn't properly encompass the whole of what is needed for a moral foundation, but also because of a very common human experience. We can encounter a vulnerable other, right, and fail to identify with their suffering. And we've seen a ton of this recently in the pandemic circumstances, the kind of the bleaker side of those circumstances. Depending on our view of their social positioning, we may in fact believe we have a reason to increase their vulnerability and suffering if we're in a position of domination. So vulnerability and injurability, we do share it with others. These are aspects of the presence of humanity in others with which, while we sometimes identify, we can also all too readily fail to identify. We can, and in fact do, sometimes flee in the face of other suffering. So So that's vulnerability. Dependency, on the other hand, to summarize this, it's also shared ontologically, but it's situated differently conceptually, I've come to believe, and write about extensively in the developing manuscript. So how dependency serves as the foundation of moral responsibility, it's not a matter of identification with others, right? Rather, our mutual dependence or interdependence is constitutive of coming to be and really continuing to exist as human beings with full agency, with a full range of life. So I guess in summary, the role that interdependence plays as constitutive will render it, to my mind, morally special, for lack of a better term. It's this distinctively of interdependence, this distinctive nature of interdependence that serves as the foundation of moral responsibility. It is, I think, in short, really why we must care for one another.
Thank you, Sarah. Next question for Guillaume. I'm sorry, I'm moving quickly from question to question, even though I have a lot of remarks I would like to make. I just want to make sure we go through all the planned questions, and we do have some time for the audience. So some public figures are concerned that the protection of life is done at all costs, in particular at the expense of our freedoms. And in this context, when I say life, I just mean survival, mere life, bare life. What do you think of this debate? Is there an alleged sacralization of life or of some lives, or rather is it a debasement, a degradation of what we consider to be life? As you describe in your book, La fin de l'hospitalité, that I mentioned at the beginning, The End of Hospitality, written with Fabienne Brugère, hospitality proceeds from a pre-understanding of the vulnerability of all life. Shouldn't it then be protected in the same way as soon as it is in danger each time, as notably was the case in with the precarious life of the migrant and the migrant crises we've all witnessed?
Thank you very much for the question. Perhaps I will return shortly to the first answer that I used to develop at the beginning, because I think what has emerged during this crisis is perhaps the raw fact of inequality before protection. I mean, the sacralization of life that we observed, it's a fact, is in reality the sacralization of a certain form of life developed especially in the Western world. And we must remember that we were quite indifferent at the beginning to the virus, as long as it appeared to us as the virus of the poor, of the populations of the third world, and that it did not touch our lands, as long as it seemed to us that it was another virus following the others, Ebola and so on, as long that it was perceived as the virus of the others, so-called others, we're quite indifferent. And I think that this reveals that our ability to represent a common vulnerability, in fact, is strongly dependent on our mental map, in which we situate the most distant lives in relation to our own lives. In fact, our mental mapping implies a radical border, certainly experienced as obvious, between our first world and the third world. At the beginning of the crisis, when we did not pay much attention to the virus, the epidemic seemed, as I said, very far away, related to forms of life too close to certain natural environments. We heard so strong judgments arguing that because that the epidemic was tied to environments where the distinction between animality and humanity was not so obvious, because it was linked also to medicines from another age and so on and so on. And in fact, when the epidemic hit our first world, we were forced to revise this mental map, since we discovered that we were also vulnerable to the so-called virus of the others, which in fact became at this moment our own virus. There was then, I think, a brief moment of brief equality in the experience of common vulnerability, which was very interesting, but did not last, because we quickly, as I said, reconstituted ourselves by taking over the discourse of protection. So that the equally vulnerable first world has recreated boundaries of protection that we take for granted because we are located within those boundaries, but which represent an absolute tragedy for all the populations that are excluded from this possibility of protection inside our own world and also outside. The staggering mortality in India today reveals the extreme inequality of vaccine responses to the virus in the world. Precarious populations also in our own societies, we all know that they are more affected by the virus. Thus, and it is a very important point for me, life, I would say, has become an absolute universal to be protected without condition, and that is to say that we are in a moment of biopolitics, so to say, but life has become an absolute universal to be protected without protection at the very moment when protection has imposed itself as an instrument of power. An instrument of power that has recreated many social, gender, and ethnic boundaries between those who protect and those who are protected. There are these two aspects of protection, those who protect and those who are protected. Life has become unequal because of the different possibilities to be protected. And so new social divisions were thus created between lives. These divisions are very strong divisions between the first and the third world, but they reveal many other divisions in relation to the inequality of protection in the face of treats that undo lives. And in reality, that would be my last word. I think we should return to a radical questioning of democracy by asking ourselves how to institute a true democracy of care in order to fight against the neoliberal governmentalities of our societies. And I will return to the reflections produced by John Tronto in Caring Democracy. I quote, she says, from the standpoint of an ethic of care, citizens should be able to expect more from the state and civil society in guaranteeing that their caring needs and those of their loved ones will be met. But she still argues, quotation, at the same time, citizens must become more committed to producing the kind of values, practices, and institutions that will allow democratic society to more coherently provide for its democratic, caring citizens. So it seems to me that it's very important to recognize at the same time that we experience the absolute need of protection, that there are strong inequalities in protecting, in the fact of protection, in the value of protection. Who really is protecting the other? Are the protectors also protected? In what extent are they protected? Are there social boundaries between the people who receive a protection and people who are obliged to go outside and to take the risk of protecting other people? In fact, these questions, which are, of course, social questions, are obvious in our world, in our Western world, but they become more and more dramatic when we refer to the absolute boundaries between our world and the third world. I think perhaps we have a too strong Western comprehension of caring attitude. So it will be very, very interesting to question caring responses from a South perspective.
Thank you, Guillaume. So you mentioned quite a few things, and one of the things that caught my attention was this emphasis on protecting others. And I think, you know, one sphere where this protection was especially relevant was actually providing healthcare. So I would want to ask Fiona about what was the provision of healthcare? How was healthcare organized? Obviously, medical workers, whether nurses or doctors, they were somehow in charge of protecting us, but who was protecting them, and what was the response to the protection of healthcare workers, since they were actually probably the most endangered when working with patients who were in hospitals and who needed healthcare, but I would also say, you know, a lot of emotional care as well.
Yes, I do. If I have time to make a short answer, I do agree with you. In fact, there are two levels of relations between care and protection. Of course, the level you mentioned is very important, but healthcare, who is going to take care of the people who take care of us? So in a medical way and so on. And we have seen, especially during the first crisis, that medical people taking care of us were taken into consideration by different kind of gestures. The fact is that we should not forget that caring involves also other functions of providing services for people, and it implies the way our dustbins are cleaned, so by instance, and the way the different way we've seen really that we have to take into consideration what we call in a manner that I don't like, dirty jobs of care. There is also a dark side of care, which is a social one that is not so often taken into consideration, but briefly appeared during this crisis. And there is the interrogation you have now at the moment, Marco. I totally agree with it, but just let's embrace, let's have perhaps a broad interrogation on who is taking care of us. That will be very, very useful, I think.
Thanks. Fiona, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so the question you provided me with earlier had to do with you know, what has been revealed about the way in which the cultures of providing healthcare, by what has been revealed by the pandemic with regard to that, and what would a provision of healthcare that is informed by an ethics of care look like. So again, as with the first question, you know, there are huge disparities, obviously, around the world in terms of the way that healthcare is organized and delivered. So quite difficult to comment on this generally. And again, I would reiterate my earlier point that, you know, the pandemic is really revealing things that existed beforehand. And we're just seeing them more clearly now, I think, as a result. So I would make 3 points, I think, about the way in which we think about healthcare, and the way in which we might think about it from a more care ethical perspective. The first point has to do with what scholars of global health or public health call the structural determinants of health. And so without going into a lot of detail about that, I think that the pandemic has revealed the need to think about our health more holistically, if you will, to consider what, as I said, was sometimes called the structural determinants of health. So the point of, you know, medical care is to keep us healthy, feeling secure, enjoying a sense of well-being, not only for our own bodies and minds, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but also for those who are dependent on us and for those on whom we depend. So healthcare is about our individualized bodies, but I don't think we can understand what it means to feel healthy, to feel secure, to have a sense of well-being just from an individualistic perspective, right? I am not going to be healthy if my child is not healthy, whether that's sort of physically with COVID or mentally as a result of lockdowns, et cetera. So I think we need to think as care ethics puts ethics in context, I think we need to put to understand health in a kind of socio-economic context as well. I think we need to challenge the dichotomy between medical care given to us by doctors and nurses, sort of like what Guillaume was saying, and other kinds of care, right? To recognize that care that keeps us healthy is provided from a range of sources. And so this is in no way to diminish the hugely important work done by doctors and nurses and other medical professionals. But it is a very broad task to keep societies healthy. And I think we need to understand our health as embedded in socioeconomic structures, norms, and institutions. One example I would give, an issue that was quite a big issue here in the province of Ontario in Canada, where I live, where the largest city in Canada, Toronto, is located, also the capital, Ottawa, was the question of paid sick days for essential workers. So this became a big issue as the pandemic raged on, and you know, epidemiologists were trying to make clear that the source of the rise in cases was coming not from necessarily the things we thought they were, but from the fact that essential workers, people who work in food processing plants, for example, to get food on our table, or people who work in Amazon warehouses, right, where we who are wealthy enough to order all the provisions we need online depend upon the people in these warehouses to get them out to us. So this is an issue that is about the structural determinants of health. Those workers had to go to work because of their precarious situations, because of their fear of losing their jobs. And they were deemed essential, so they didn't have the luxury of working at home like we did. And therefore they were getting sick, they were dying, they were passing it on to their family members. So I think that, you know, we need policy that goes beyond a narrow understanding of medical care or health care. Just one other quick example I would give would be what the United Nations has called the shadow pandemic. And that's regarding gender-based violence that's happening in the home. You know, again, this is not a new issue, but you know, violence against women has skyrocketed as a result of lockdowns. And this is a health issue. This is a real physical life and death cost of what Carol Gilligan calls the persistence of patriarchy. That doesn't mean all men are culpable here, but as long as we continue to socialize men and boys towards autonomy, individualism, rejection of relationality, I think we will see this kind of response, one that is exacerbated by the stress of the pandemic. And so again, we need to think about health and medical care more holistically. Tied to this, I'd just say very closely related, we need to think about health relationally, move beyond binary, dichotomous, hierarchical thinking that categorizes us into sick and healthy, able-bodied and disabled, physical health versus mental health, elderly and young, and begin to think about health and well-being through the lifespan, and thinking about us as always dependent, perhaps not at every moment, but all people are dependent on others at certain times in their lives, whether they're classified as sick or disabled or not. And we need to recognize that good health is not achieved autonomously, that care is required for all people, regardless of the condition of their health throughout their lifespan. And the mental health issue that I mentioned earlier is something very real that has skyrocketed throughout this pandemic. And again, as long as we separate physical health from mental health, we won't see the interrelatedness of these. A final point, because I know we're getting a little short on time, we need to find a way of decentering and challenging the power dynamics, I think, between healthcare providers and the receivers of care, and recognizing the way that this dynamic is also cut through with racial, gender, class, and other hierarchies. So in other words, we need to think about epistemic injustice and recognize that people who are not medical professionals nonetheless know a lot about their own health and the health of others close to them. I could say more, but I'll stop.
Thank you, Fiona. Yes, yeah. Obviously, there's much to say about these topics, but I think it's something that you pointed out as well, that this whole situation that we're in revealed actually a lot of different things and exacerbated many of the issues we have been facing. And one of them, I think, is also in economic precarity. We've seen, and so this would be my question for Sarah. So we've seen that in these times, a lot of people have lost their jobs, and obviously, if one loses his or her job, it makes it difficult to care for one's family and other people who depend on us, and it seems fairly clear to me that this also has ramifications, not just in the present time when a person is without a job, but also later in life. And it seems to me that this is kind of connected to a much broader question again of the way in which the labor market is structured. So we've seen, it is very important whether a person has a temporary contract or a full-time contract, whether they might be renewed or not, and different countries have responded to this economic precarity in different ways. So, for example, in our country, in Serbia, there was a campaign to provide every citizen with a certain amount of money, and for different reasons. But the kind of general question that is, I think, worth thinking about says, how should our labor market be restructured in a post-pandemic world that hopefully will come soon?
So that is a large question. I will take a small part of, and I will also note that as kind of acknowledgement of the way in which Fiona Robinson's work has been very important to my own, two things she said were things that I was about to say. So I will retool a bit too. I mean, I think she's made some really excellent points that pertain to this issue as well. So, I mean, I think that, right. So Marco, in this really fascinating question, so I think this question is helpful for the ways in which it's going to focus our attention on the crucial significance of social political positioning, right? And so in answering, what I want to really do is zero in on the precarity that certain gendered and racialized workers experience, as well as those who are also economically disadvantaged in different ways. So, right, so I want to start with like as background, kind of the general notion of precarity, and which I know everyone on screen probably knows, but let me just remind you of the audience of how this works. So precariousness is going to exhibit this split between, as we've been talking about, being shared as a basic feature of what it is to be human, but also being, it will be differentially experienced in conjunction with like local conditions and social situatedness. So quite famously now, Judith Butler introduced a terminological distinction to capture this difference. And so she talks about precariousness as the inherent condition of insecurity in which we find ourselves as humans. And that precariousness is distinguished from, of course, precarity, which refers to like the different ways we can be, the degrees of instability and insecurity that track forms of oppression and structural injustice. So, and this is a lot of what we've seen with the labor issues that have emerged in the context of the pandemic. So those who are disadvantaged and disenfranchised are more likely to live lives that are characterized by tremendous risk and fragility. What Butler does that I think is quite helpful is she notes that precarity then is, as she says, I think this is in a 2015 book, that precarity is going to be differentially distributed. I think this notion of understanding how precarity is differentially distributed has really, we've known this, but it's come to the fore in a very acute way in analyzing the pandemic. So if we hold this distinction in mind, we can, I think, understand how precariousness and precarity, and really in terms of human finitude, proves eliminating for the pandemic. So who's borne the brunt of the pandemic labor precarity? To understand this, we have to think about who occupies the role of essential workers who absorb the risk of allowing others, as Fiona was saying, to access food, to access medical resources. I'll comment, I think, critically on our own circumstances in the United States because they're closest at hand and because I feel most comfortable critiquing my own country. In the US, those essential workers are often people of color and people who are economically disadvantaged. And the racial history of inequality in the US has given rise to even more profound forms of inequality and injustice in the experience of the pandemic. And importantly, in the distributions of the harm of the pandemic, right? The other key factor here is gender inequality, right? So last week, or maybe earlier this week, I think it was late last week, the New York Times dubbed the recent labor experiences of women, instead of a recession, a she-session, which I think is a catchy term and helpful for focusing our attention on the gender dimensions of this problem. So to give you a scope of the problem within the US, so the Times reported that women in the US, they accounted for 55% of the, I think it was something like 20 million jobs lost in April from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And what this did was to raise the unemployment rate for adult women to about 15% from originally 3.1% in February. By point of comparison, the unemployment rate for adult men was 13%, right? So you see the stark contrast. And in fact, women of color have fared worse with higher rates of unemployment. So what drives this she-session, as they're calling it? I think a significant part of it is driven by, of course, by forms of vulnerability, dependency, and precarity, but specifically that are created by wanting and needing to care for others, right? And so this is what I hope is a slightly distinctive feature that I'll add to this conversation. So we want to care for our loved ones, and especially those that are profoundly dependent, either because they're children or because they're elderly. In heteronormative families within the US, women have pretty much been expected to step back from their jobs in order to care for children, for example, who no longer have childcare or haven't had childcare in the pandemic, or children who were in remote schooling. And so this is it's not the only driver, but it is a primary driver behind those labor statistics that I just shared with you. The other thing that I'll touch on lightly, since Fiona's already mentioned it, right, the kind of shadow pandemic, right? So gender-based violence against women has risen quite seriously in the context of women being in the home caring for dependents and not being out in the labor market quite as much. I think one way to understand the overarching themes that happen regarding precarity and labor is within the context of the pandemic is really through the concept of risk, right? And so what happens is it's a risk that we ask others to assume on our behalf, right? So So I'll use my own case as an example. So I have a health condition that renders me particularly vulnerable to complications from COVID. It's never really been an issue, but when COVID arose, I received medical advice that I needed to be really careful. And so I am privileged enough to do that. I was able to teach remotely, but that which made my life possible was the risk that I passed on to those who were less privileged, who were providing food for my family, for example, through food processing, through the grocery store workers who were creating orders that we would then pick up curbside. So I think we need to understand that instead of simply like sort of applauding those who have risked their lives in this way, we need to understand two things. Number one, we bear a strong responsibility to respond to the ways in which we've passed those risks on to others from our position of privilege. And two, we're not only passing it on to those individuals, right? We're passing it on to their families. We're passing the risk on to their broader communities. And indeed, there are epidemiological patterns that really show that show concretely how this risk has panned out. So I think in responding to this, what's the least we could do within the US? And this is where my own criticisms of my country arise. We could provide vaccines to those whom we asked to assume that risk. And that has not gone terribly well within the US. Moreover, to take a broader or a higher level global perspective, I think we need to think about structural forms of responsibility, right? And the ways in which risks are passed on not only to my local grocery worker, but to broader labor chains within global economies, and recognize, and again, criticizing my own country, that we need to provide vaccines to those who are on the losing end of structural chains of injustice, more broadly speaking. And so basically, I think the US needs to stop hoarding their vaccines and start sharing it with some others, and up production such that that's possible. So that's my ultimate concrete kind of response to your excellent question, Marco. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So just a reminder about logistics and time. We are technically in the time when we were supposed to open for the audience. So we have 3 more questions left and a general last question for all. So maybe if we keep the last one brief, or we stay a little bit longer, if nobody minds to stay until 8:30, maybe 8:30 over here. So it's getting later for Estelle and Guillaume. I hope for you, Fiona and Sarah, that time-wise, it's not okay. I'll try to be brief and switch over to Guillaume. And something you already mentioned a little bit, I think, when you were addressing Fiona's question as well, and it's related also to the notion of precarity. And this is this idea of who are all the people who cared for us, and how come some people are more deserving of care than others. Me as a philosopher and with a legal background, I'm always very attentive to words and how they create what you've mentioned, also a sort of cognitive mapping, a perception of what's acceptable or unacceptable, or how they create potential dangers the way we use words. And recently I've listened to you on the radio, Guillaume, talk about, I will translate it to English, but it sounded even better, stronger in French, how a life in poverty is everything but a poor life. And about this tendency to reduce people who live in poverty, all of their needs to just economical gains, and everything else is irrelevant. So therefore, if they're going to be risking their lives in order to provide something for those who are better off, they're doing that because they need to economically. And to come to my question, as I said, to be quick, since the publication of your book about, in particularly this, Vie ordinaire, vie précaire, I assume it would translate ordinary lives, precarious lives, you have worked on the notion here in France as much as probably Butler in the States. And I wonder always, what is the difference between precarity and poverty? Is it a social and a mental state as well, a state that affects the subjective capacities of those who are immersed in it? Is there an intermediate state between inclusion and exclusion? And why is precarity doubly interesting? What about the way we look at precarious lives?
Thank you very much for the question. I will shortly answer, try to shortly answer. Because yes, you mentioned my work on precarity, and it's true that when I worked on precarity, no one was really interested in France with such a topic. And in fact, there was a very interesting intersection with Judith Butler's work at the same time. But Judith Butler was coming to precarity from a very interesting reflection on the politics of crying, of tears in the experience of mourning following the September 11 attacks. It was on the one hand to ask to what extent being exposed to the violence of an unknown other to the point of death might not give rise to a violent response in return. And on the other hand, to question the conditions by which only a truly mourned life is one that can be apprehended as a life fully lived. Life is precarious, according to her, insofar as it is exposed to the possibility of death, and also insofar as life is not being mourned and therefore not appears as a life fully lived. And it's very interesting the way she moved from this concept of precarity into another concept, perhaps a concept of social precariousness, including a reflection on neoliberal conditions of putting lives in competitions, of undoing certain lives, and forcing them into logics of survival. So that for her, the political question of the alliance of all precarious life, including the lives that are precarious in their gender, became more and more relevant to her. And in a certain sense, my path in precarity is symmetrical. I mean, I started from a social understanding of precarity because I was really, really amazed in a negative sense by all the people who try to say that precarity is something natural that we have to accept as the air we are respiring in a sense. And I try to define precarity as a social construction, a kind of course, it's a kind of ideal type distinction, a kind of intermediate social state between a regime of pure inclusion and a regime of exclusion. And I came to be interested in all forms of life, situated both inside and outside. I wrote a book called Dedans dehors, and that was the experience that I tried to analyze in order to give sense to precarity. Precarity appeared to me as in-between experience between inside and outside, including of course, for instance, migrant lives, insofar as this inside-outside is precisely the hybrid form through which precarity is constructed. In this sense, precarity crosses poverty, but it is not reduced to it insofar as extreme poverty, for instance, could be characterized by the imposition of a radical exclusion, as it is the case, for example, of the persons living in the streets whose social properties have been erased. And in contrast, I would say that life is precarious when one of the major social properties for an existence is unavailable. For example, work or housing or social protection or health coverage. And I think we become precarious when we have all the social properties except one or except two, and so on. In this perspective, deepening this intermediate zone of inside-outside, I discovered that to be vulnerable is precisely to be exposed to the erasure of one's major social property, including, of course, the title of residence of a national certification guaranteeing perennial access to one's society. And in all these analyses, I pay great attention to the designations by which lives are constructed as other lives. I mean, precarious to be designed as a precarious one, or to be designed as a foreigner or unemployed and so on, these are designations and by no means immediate data of experience. We should understand that these are words by which forms of experience are revealed and obscured at the same time by the designation. So, because the way of characterizing a life as precarious, as foreigner, and so on, depends largely to the kind of language games that circulate in social norms, including social protection, in relation also to special hegemonic language games that construct precarity in a certain sense, so that when we speak of people telling that they are precarious people, we also have a kind of philosophy, in a bad sense, constructing by that suspends the possibility of someone to let speak his or her own experience. And so the questions that arise are then to know how we can live when we are designated in such an enduring way. What's the kind of life forced into designation? How the designated lives unfold as another life, and under what political but also anthropological conditions can one, so to speak, de-designate oneself? How to counteract the alteration of lives produced by designations? So I just conclude by saying that perhaps the only good thing about the epidemic that we know nowadays is that it forces us to consider or to reconsider, I don't know, the close link between vulnerability and precariousness. We have discovered ourselves as vulnerable. We have discovered the other people as vulnerable. And thus we are in a position now, I think, to imagine a common experience of vulnerability involving the experience of social precarity, which is at this point a kind of special vulnerability. And one perhaps of the major philosophical arguments to be produced today is to preserve this link between vulnerability and precarity, which seems to be, to me, to be less and less acquired because of what we call arrogance of the neoliberal responses to the crisis that tend to us to construct in a new and a strong way frontiers between precarity and vulnerability. And it seems to me that it would be a mistake not to take the occasion, to take the opportunity now to reconsider precarity from the point of view of our common vulnerability.
Thank you, Guillaume. And I'll try to kind of connect some of the things, and especially some of the things that Sarah mentioned that I think are spot on, even though I won't allow myself to criticize U.S. policy, but I would be glad to.
You're welcome to.
I would be more glad to criticize policies of my own country, since I'm more familiar with them. But I think you mentioned some very interesting point that hasn't been developed, so I'll ask Fiona a bit about that, because I think it can be nicely connected. So Sarah mentioned this kind of U.S. hoarding of vaccines that are not being distributed to those who need them. And as in her example, Sarah mentioned, it's not just about my local shop or local delivery person, but it is kind of a global thing. So our food is being produced not in our own neighborhood, but also somewhere else in poorer countries. And we've seen also not just the hoarding of vaccines, but also of ventilators, for example, that in the beginning at least, and then unfortunately recently we've also seen things happening in India where there's no oxygen, and a very dramatic situation going on there. And some other countries stepped in and said, okay, we're going to help you. We're going to send you some aid. And so what I was thinking throughout, not just this whole period, but also our conversation, is it seems, some might say in response to Sarah, well, look, we're legally purchasing all these stuff. We're legally purchasing vaccines. We're legally purchasing ventilators. So, who's to say that we're doing something wrong? We want to help and secure our own people of our own country. And, if we have the opportunity, we will help those others in need. So what I was thinking, what do we tell those wealthy countries to this kind of argument that they would make? We're legally purchasing supplies, and I would at least want to say, well, there's something wrong about that way of thinking. And then so what would you say is wrong, if anything, with this kind of argument that someone might make?
Yeah, thank you, Marco. And yeah, I was pleased that Sarah sort of ended that way, it's saying that we need to think about this not just in our own communities or even our own nation states, but globally. And as you know, these are the kinds of questions I've been thinking about for many years. How can we bring an ethics of care to the sphere of beyond just our personal relations or even our countries, but to the sphere of world or global politics? And I can tell you, it's not always been easy, but I think I would start by saying, you're absolutely right in saying that there's something wrong with the rules-based international order, the way it's currently set up. And I would get to that in a moment. But I think that I would start by saying that it's absolutely crucial at this moment that countries begin sharing excess doses. And you almost don't even need any kind of a moral argument, right? You just need the infectious diseases experts, right, to tell you that this is not, this is a kind of an existential crisis we're facing in the world. And thinking about it in any other way will be extremely harmful for everybody. So hoarding more doses than are needed now is absolutely the wrong thing to do. And thinking that we don't need to share those doses is simply, I think, the hubris of the privileged. So far in the West, as we've noted already today, the West has been able to insulate itself from the harms of pandemics, right? Which, as Guillaume was saying, these are things that occur somewhere else. So far, we've, in the West, I think, and in the global North, have been able to simply reap the benefits of globalization without recognizing any of the harms. So now we need to recognize that we are inextricably entangled, and that we need to share vaccines urgently, immediately. First, and most importantly, well, I don't know, you can't make a hierarchy of these things. All of these things are important. So first, to help urgently the people who continue to die at amazing rates in countries around the world. You mentioned India, but of course there are many others. And secondly, to recognize what the experts have told us, that as long as this virus stays, the more it will mutate until it reaches a point where it is resistant to 2 doses of existing vaccines. So this, I think, is an urgent thing that we must deal with right now. In terms, sort of philosophically speaking, I have argued before, and I would still argue, that we need to stop thinking about this in terms of what we might call kind of classic global distributive justice questions. This kind of paradigm, again, sets us up in this very strict dichotomy between a kind of cosmopolitan approach and a nationalist approach. And it's framed in terms of fairness, but also in terms of benevolence, right? What does justice require in terms of what wealthy countries should give up for poor countries? And I think from a care ethics perspective, this is very limited. It's a very Eurocentric, very Western perspective. It fails to account for the role of the West in creating the inequalities in the first place. And so it's not about what we give up, but what in fact we owe based on our past and existing harms. And we might think of colonialism, but we don't even need to think. We can think about the way, as you said, the rules-based international order, whether it's trade issues or other kinds of legal issues, keep hierarchies in place. And I think global distributive justice paradigms keep those hierarchies in place because they're about the haves and the have-nots, as opposed to recognizing historical and ongoing entanglements. So, also those kinds of approaches are very state-centric. A care ethics approach is much more multi-scalar. So it looks at the interrelations between sites and spaces from the household level to the global level and thinks about them as interconnected. So distributive schemes like COVAX, I think, are very important in the short term, but limited in the long term. And I'm so aware of the time, but I'm glad we can go a little bit over. I'll just finish by saying, again, that these kinds of approaches focus too much on ethics and not enough on politics, right? So I think sometimes distributive justice paradigms that want to come up with a principle for fair distribution want to do ethics first and politics second, as opposed to thinking of these things as inherently political problems that need ethical political solutions. Care ethics, I think, pays attention to relations of power and historical and social context when thinking about ethics. And so when they would do that, I think they would turn their attention to things that have been very much in the news, like intellectual property. As many of you know, there have been debates about whether we need to not just sell our excess vaccines, but actually think about the way that the international order is set up to protect big pharmaceutical companies and Western states in that intellectual property. And as I'm sure you know, there was a proposed waiver of the TRIPS agreement, which would have temporarily suspended intellectual property rights, originally proposed by India and South Africa. Originally, the big pharmaceutical companies dismissed the idea. Other critics included people like Bill Gates, somebody who's very, very powerful in his own kind of philanthro-capitalist kind of way, because he was worried about the diminished financial incentives for future research. But I think we need to ask questions about powerful people, not just people like Jeff Bezos, but also people like Bill Gates and what their way of thinking about these problems. So I'm going to skip over a few things that I wanted to say, but simply that, I heard today in the news leaders of the WHO, the WTO, the IMF saying that vaccine policy is economic policy now. And I also heard the other day someone saying vaccine policy is security policy. So I think we need to, again, recognize that we need long-term change in terms of the way the global political economy is set up to deal with these unfair rules and to think more relationally in the future going forward.
Thank you, Fiona. I'm very happy to see how the questions keep kind of adding on to each other. And so saying, Estelle, sorry to keep you waiting so long, but we've envisioned this. I think it worked out well for you to open with the first question being the more conceptual one, and now to you, the political one, as Fiona was saying, how global distributive justice thinks ethics first and politics seconds. And I always try to work towards saying one without the other even the first word, the first sentence of my thesis is one from Rousseau, where he says, those who want to separate morals and politics will never understand either or. With that in mind, reading your latest book that came out last year, 2020, The Fragility of Concern for Others, Adorno and the Ethics of Care, available in English and French, you present an in-depth analysis of the capitalist form of life, strained by a generalized indifference, and demonstrate how it produces a compartmentalized attention to others, one that is very limited to a very particular task and a domain, and mostly attributed to women, or as we were saying, the racialized or gendered others, people of color, depending on the country we're speaking. So one of the most recent and most flagrant examples of this type of social injustice, as well as gender inequality, has been the treatment of the so-called essential workers. I've heard also references to them as expandable instead of essential. I find that interesting. In France, for example, the government has given exorbitant amounts of money to help companies such as Renault or Air France. And yet when we were talking about bettering the conditions, the working condition of healthcare providers, a lack of resources was mentioned, and there was a temporary one short-term bonus as far as I remember. And instead, we had this hero discourse, how they are our saviors. We have a lot of imagery on social media where superheroes are giving their capes to nurses and doctors. We had people applauding on balconies at a certain hour, and I have nothing against that. But my question is, it seems as this justifies the poor working conditions and shows them as inevitable, or even worse, that these workers are so selfless that they're not even concerned about the risks they face, nor the income they make. So how do we begin to address the many layers of this problem, to apprehend the concern for others through the many obstacles that capitalism has put into place, such as the privatization of care or the commodification of values?
Okay, so thank you. The first element I want to mention is the fact that what we have observed, and especially in France, is when it comes to thinking about capitalism, is the return of the state. And so we cannot speak anymore about privatization or neoliberalism. Maybe what we have seen is the state going back as an economic actor. He was already playing as an actor, but it was in a much more silent way. Now it has an obvious voice. And for instance, in France, we had our president that said that, well, during all the pandemic, everyone would be helped, no matter what it takes. That was the motto used a lot of times. So we have this return of the state. And now we have the state and the market, I would say, going hand in hand, and going hand in hand in order to produce a certain discourse on vulnerability on the one hand and on responsibility on the other hand. On vulnerability, because we should see what counts in those measures, in those social policies, as vulnerable. It is striking that, as you mentioned, what is vulnerable is the economic system. I mean, it's not the economical individuals. It's only the economic system. Okay, and it's that is why so much money is given to companies and things like that. And on the other hand, you have also had a distribution of responsibilities around those essential workers. For instance, during the first lockdown, we had to rely on deliveries. So the idea that in order to protect not only us, but everyone in France who were supposed to rely on deliveries. So you have people who would deliver and who were supposed to expose themselves, and it was not a problem. I mean, so we have this discourse that actually distributes both vulnerability. The system is vulnerable, people maybe not. I mean, economical individuals maybe not, and also responsibilities. And this is the way you have this new coupling, I would say, between the state and the economical system. And and this works, and you were referring to my work on the fragility of concern for others. And in this book, I work starting from a concept that I borrow from Adorno, that is the concept of bourgeois coldness. So we think about coldness as something which is at the core of the way capitalism works. And I would say that what we see in general, but especially what we see now, is the fact that our capitalism does not work only with coldness; it also works with warmth, with care, and it both are intricated. And this is what you can see in those example you gave us. For instance, of course you have people who are praised because they are so selfless that actually they just accept to sacrifice themselves. But that was the case for the physicians. That was the case for people working in hospitals. There was I would say a double use of affect in here, a double use of warmth, as I would put it. That is the fact that actually people were supposed to sacrifice themselves in order to serve other people because they were selfless. Okay, it was about moral dispositions, moral affect, and things like that. So you had warmth there, but it was only for the most competent ones, I would say. And this was linked to also something that actually relied on coldness, and the fact that going back to those guys that the Uber deliverers and things like that, we were just simply exploited and nobody cared. Really, it was pure coldness. I don't think that anyone said that they were so selfless that actually it was in order to save the world that they were doing what they were doing. No, everybody knew that actually they had no choice. I mean, there was no other options for them. So I would say that going back to your questions, what we observe now when it comes to capitalism is this new arrangement of the state and the economy system that works by relying both on coldness when it comes to certain people and warmth, care, which is mobilized, instrumentalized in order to produce some practices and also to reward those practices. That is, we are so grateful for what some of us did. And the whole system works with that instead of requiring higher salaries or something like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Estelle. So the final question is for everyone, and I'll just let you all jump in with your remarks, responses in whatever order you want, and then we'll leave some time for the audience and their questions. So I think the final question really is a good closure, even though we could not anticipate your answers, it's just right. By disrupting even the life of people in the Western world and all of those better off in the world who have usually had superior means of protection from various forms of vulnerability, the coronavirus pandemic has made us probably more aware now than before of the unsustainability of certain ways of living, the importance of having employment security as well as institutions and relations that we can rely on. The pandemic then is a perfect illustration of capitalist dysfunctionality and injustice. It reveals the inextricable intertwinement of all of the system's contradictions and crises tendencies. We could not ask for a better lesson in critical social theory. What positive changes then might an ethic and politics of care recommend for our individual behaviors and various policies within nation states, or for the interactions between different nation states, as well as our relationships with the environment? Could we end up seeing the profound importance of creating and maintaining caring relationships for our well-being, the potential usefulness of providing a universal basic income, or a reinvention of our relationship with nature, previously based on control and domination? Do we require a paradigm shift? So a very, very big question. Feel free to answer briefly, examples, parts of the questions, whatever spoke to you most. Everyone's muted, just so you know. Unmute yourselves.
I feel like maybe Sarah should go, or somebody who hasn't spoken. I was the second last to speak, Sarah or Guillaume.
I can start. Yeah, that's fine. So yes, I think we require a paradigmatic shift. And I've been thinking a lot about this shift in terms of how we might understand care's radical potential. So this is radical care is a term that's emerged and been tossed around fairly recently within the past year or two. And so I've been thinking about when we say that care can be radical, what do we mean? On one level, I think we mean that we recognize the ways in which care can really reveal systematic inequality and unjust power structures. But I think in understanding care's radical potential, we actually need to go and think about the work of Angela Davis. So she's oft quoted as saying, and I'll quote her here directly, radical simply means grasping things at the root. And she originally delivered that comment in an address at Spelman College in 1987. What I believe grasping things at the root is a reference to is actually Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right from 1843. And I'll skip the original quote because we don't have a ton of time. But in light of that quote where Marx says directly, to be radical is to grasp things at the root, I think what grasping things at the root will accomplish in employing care in this way is it really represents an aim to understand and productively destabilize current habits of thought, modes of being, and economies of vulnerability and dependency that tend to prioritize the well-being of a privileged few over and at the expense of the harm and dispossession of the many and differently oppressed, as we've been discussing. So in this kind of direct nod to Marx, I also want to note that the COVID-19 pandemic, it served as an opportunity perhaps for care theory to gain material force as more and more people step into this form of growing awareness of care as a previously invisible fuel on which society runs. So in thinking about this response, I will condense it, but so I've developed a 5-point response of ways in which care can be radical, and I'll offer just sort of a sentence for each. So care, I think, can be radical as critique, as understood as multiscalar, as catalyst, and ultimately as epistemically complicated, right? So care can be radical as critique in that we can sharpen the critical edges of care theories that will produce critical insights concerning both the current state of caring institutions and really past limitations of earlier manifestations of care ethics itself, right? I think care also, I think I forgot to mention this one, can be understood as a matter of right and of human right to give and receive care. And this serves as a public call to assume responsibility for better meeting the needs of caregivers and care receivers. And I think importantly, exploration of care as a right really needs to happen through mechanisms that understand the rights to give and receive care very far beyond the confines of a white heteronormative patriarchal family. So 3 other quick points. So care is multiscalar. This is ways in which we can see care necessarily functioning on multiple levels simultaneously, which brings about, I think, powerful possibilities for broad scale transformation of injustice, including forms of intimate injustice, relational injustice, social and structural injustice as well. I think care understood in a radical light serves as a catalyst, right? So care theories and practices encourage this expansion and a transformation of moral perception, and really moral perception regarding which relationships and forms of relationality are understood to hold moral and political significance. Most importantly, and this addresses one thread of the question that you asked, Zona, most importantly is this broadening beyond an anthropocentric concept of care between humans to worlds and relationships beyond the human. So for example, one approach I have in mind is the work of Jody Bird and others who are exploring the notion of a grounded relationality. And that's one case. So finally, care is complicated. I mean, I think everything that I've said in these final remarks needs to be noted that while care can function as a radical disruptor of structural injustice and an amplifier, I think, of healing relationality, a good degree of caution is also necessary. So we can't advocate an unthinking acceptance of the modalities of care because of how practices and policies of care can actually function to maintain the status quo and sometimes function violently. So there needs to be a type of caring vigilance in the form of something like self-critique and epistemic humility in the face of others' experiences that's necessary to realize and sustain the radical power of care. So I want to close maybe unexpectedly by focusing on these epistemic dimensions of care, where I think we need to guard against the epistemic harms of bad care. So if we recognize our privilege, this is going to shift both how we give and receive care, and privileged carers will hold, and I mean this intimately, socially, but also globally. So privileged carers will hold a series of epistemic responsibilities of care that require them to root out epistemic injustice in the form, for example, of testimonial injustice or testimonial quieting and smothering. what might we do instead on the positive side in response to these forms of epistemic oppression and harm? Both Jose Medina and Vrinda Dalmia give us a good sense of guide here. Medina advocates that we develop something called Kaleidoscopic Consciousness, in which we take epistemic friction between perspectives and use it to help us move forward to achieve a better form of epistemic equilibrium. So Medina and Dalmia both also recommend a series of epistemic virtues to embrace. And I think this is an interesting way of closing and thinking about how care might become more radical. So virtues such as curiosity and open-mindedness, and Dalmia's work emphasizes the virtue of relational humility. So I want to end kind of hopefully, but also recognizing that we need to consistently critically engage care itself and not take it as necessarily always a positive thing because of ways in which it can, in fact, evoke forms of violence too. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So in the meantime, I realized that Guillaume has to leave us pretty soon for another meeting. So I was thinking we could jump to you with this question, or also if you would like to answer another question, one of the members of our workshop, Anshul, has a question for you. So I don't know, Anshul, if you want me to read it or if you want to ask it.
Sure, Zona, go ahead. You can read it if you want.
You go ahead. Thank you so much for the question. I think you would like it.
Sure, I can. Yeah, my question was about thinking about precarity at a vast scale. For instance, in India, since the second wave of pandemic, about 230 million people have gone down into poverty line, below the poverty line. And so thinking about precarity at such a large scale, where it is such a big number that it is almost invisible. The sense of precarity is so widespread that one is not able to think about the needs and dependencies of such a diverse group of people. So that was my first question about thinking about precarity at such a tremendous scale that it's hard to visualize and probe at. And another thing that I was curious about was this notion of moral fatigue that was mentioned. And so in April and May in India, about 200,000 people died. And the role that the state played in all of this was that a lot of elections and religious gatherings were allowed. So what does that say about the moral fatigue that perhaps the state itself is suffering from? And compared to moral fatigue that an individual suffers from, where you can just say that, okay, I don't really have the responsibility because responsibility is impossible. But in case of the state, moral fatigue, how does one think about moral fatigue in that at that level where it affects so many people? That's my question. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Anshul. Guillaume, you're still on mute.
Yes, perhaps I can try to answer. It's a set of very interesting questions. Of course, I think we have to perhaps to recognize that we are quite poor in our own categories in order to think, if we want really to think what appears to as so dramatic events, even of course in India nowadays, perhaps we must for the first time suspend our categories. I'm not sure. But it's a kind of philosophical reflection that I have at the moment. I'm not sure that our categories, even as the category of precarity, can be very, very useful in a certain sense to think what is coming now as so dramatic events. And it's particularly the case in India. So there's, of course, what does precarity mean confronted with reality of a death that is everywhere in a so large number, in a so broad scale. Perhaps we should recognize at first that we are quite, that we don't have the correct categories to think such an event. And it makes me think other reflections developed from since already Sigmund Freud, when he spoke on the tragedy of a little child, which stays alone during the departure of his mother, and it tries to make a little play, playing with a game, saying fort und da. It's kind of a category in order produced, a practical category, produced in order to take into account the tragedy of the event. Perhaps my mother could live forever, and I'm not sure that she will come back. But if I play a game, perhaps she will come back. So I wonder if our categories are not such a little, not such little tools, quite useful in order to think the tragedy of the events nowadays. But of course, precarity now should be reconsidered from the point of view of a death produced at a so large scale, and the categories of responsibility and so on cannot be useful at a first point of view, I think. And it's perhaps a first answer that I would like to give to your very interesting questions.
Thank you, Guillaume. Anybody else want to continue off of this still with the same last question? Fiona?
Thank you. Yeah, the things I had prepared to say for the last question, quite similar again to Sarah's, but I'll try and focus on some slightly different things. I think that we may indeed have a kind of opening here as more and more people are witnessing the failures of economic rationality, and that the sort of myopic focus on economic growth as our only goal are really on display for everybody to see. I believe strongly that the sort of the facts of dependency and the need for care are thorns in the side of neoliberalism. In other words, the need to give and receive care cannot be neutralized by neoliberalism as much as neoliberalism will try to hide it. It's always there and always present. And as we said at the beginning of this event, before we got going, it's a shame that we required this pandemic to bring this into full view. I think that what we might need to think about doing now is to think about the kind of synergies between those of us who work on care ethics and other kinds of work, whether it's by Indigenous scholars, post-humanist scholars, environmental scholars, because I think we share a kind of common purpose, which is, again, pointing out the limitations of this focus on economic growth. So I'm really heartened when I read the work of feminist economists who are now becoming very popular, feminist economists like Kate Raworth, who wrote Donut Economics, and Mariana Mazzucato, who are really like furthering the work of other feminist economists like Nancy Folbra and Marilyn Waring, who pointed out the limitations of our understandings of economics for the world, and importantly for gender relations as well. I agree very much that we need to think about care beyond the Western, and the conference we just completed from the Care Ethics Research Consortium was themed Decentering Care, where we really wanted to amplify the voices of non-Western and Indigenous ways of knowing. You may have heard, I just want to briefly point out that something shocking that happened in Canada. It's been ongoing, of course, but I'm sure it's made the news in many countries, that there was a horrific discovery of the remains of 215 children who were attended residential schools in Canada, which were all about assimilating Indigenous people. to make them more Canadian. And I don't want to labor this point, but I think that we need to think about caring holistically. We need to think about what we can learn from Indigenous people. And as Sarah said, think about different worlds and think ecologically about our environment. And I think there could be something of a coalition here in terms of helping us engage with, as Sarah said, the radical potential of care going forward.
Thank you, Fiona. Estelle, would you like to jump in with something, or do we leave it to the audience with their questions? Estelle, are you with us? Is the connection good for you? Would you like to answer the final question, or should we open it to the audience with their questions?
Oh, sorry, I cannot hear very well, so I did not understood. I didn't understand that you are talking to me. So I just want to be brief, and I am sorry that I'm the last one to speak about. To reply to your question, because I'm going to be very pessimistic. If I go back to the last question, do we require a paradigmatic shift? Yes, but one question was, could we end up seeing the profound importance of creating and maintaining caring relationships? Again, I'm a bit pessimistic. If we see the history, let's see. After World War I, most of the parliaments were full of former soldiers who swore that it would never happen again, and that there was a huge consciousness that things should change. And I don't know, 15 years later, Hitler was elected, and 20 years later, World War II started. So I hope that what we are experiencing now as necessary will trigger some major changes, but well, let's see.
Thank you, Estelle, for that important reminder to remain critical. So speaking of which, some questions, critical remarks. The floor is yours to the audience that is still with us. Everyone's so silent. Should I call out our lab members or people from the workshop?
While people are thinking, I would just say that I agree with Estelle that it's important not to be too assuming that because of this, everything is now going to change. I would just say that I have a lot of faith in the very young people that I see and hear who seem to be talking about the world in different ways. Maybe I'm in an echo chamber, or maybe I only hear certain young people talking, and I'm sure they don't all agree. But maybe that's a good thing, and I think that the young people, may be able to bring about change. Certainly, in terms of the environment, that's, I think, a big move forward.
Yes, I've been reading a lot about this as well. The Generation Z, the Gen Z, and the ways that this has been a formatting experience for them.
Yeah.
Is everybody still remaining shy and silent? Has anybody mustered up the courage?
Yeah, I'll just, if no one from the audience yes, Manuela raised her hand. So yeah, Manuela, go. Go
ahead, Manuela, unmute.
Yes.
Well, actually, this is Philip. So
okay.
I'm Manuela's alter ego, but that's okay. We agree on most things.
We're together.
So thank you all for this extremely interesting and important discussion. I think that a word was not mentioned enough in the course of the discussion, which is the
which is a word, it's a concept, it's a reality, which is power. And power relationships, if we're talking about the different, which we should, the differential distribution of capability, the differential distribution of care, the differential distribution of the way in which the world's resources are actively deployed, we have to talk about power and power relationships in both domestic political economies and the international political economy. And I think one good way of getting at, and I'm not talking, I can't refer to the whole of the discussions that were raised here. I think one excellent way of getting at this is what Marilyn Robinson mentioned briefly, which is I think we need to focus laser-like, among other things, of course, but laser-like on the problem of the pharmaceutical giants and the way in which the pharmaceutical giants have prospered in the course of this pandemic, and the way in which states, Western states, and have interacted with those pharmaceutical giants to create to reinforce, to consolidate the monopoly situations, the monopoly conditions of action and control over global health and therefore global care. So I think that a very sharp focus on this is capable of actually mobilizing people's affects and mobilizing them politically in such a way as it serves not only as an educational instrument, but also as a means of actually concretely engaging in transformational ethics and politics today.
Thank you, Philip and Manuela. Anybody would like to answer to or add any remarks to this?
Well, I guess it wasn't so much of a question, perhaps more of a comment. But since I had mentioned the pharmaceutical companies, I would just say briefly that I agree. I mean, perhaps I didn't use the word power much, but I hope that was underlying a lot of what I was saying about the nature of the international order and the need to move beyond just a kind of global distributive justice paradigm towards an upending of the rules and regulations that keep in place the existing hierarchies of power among nation states. I agree with you that the pharmaceutical companies and the rich countries in which they are located hold a tremendous amount of power. But even somebody that I also mentioned, like Bill Gates and his hugely influential foundation, where we see him as a very benevolent force, and yet he was very much against the TRIPS waiver, very worried about diminished financial incentives for future research, but also that's code for worried about growth, economic growth and profits. And I think that we need to think about what our democracy means, in terms of thinking about how much power is located in with organizations like his. Yeah, so things I've said before, but just to reiterate.
This also echoes Anshul's question, and I've learned from him throughout the workshop that in India currently the vaccination process has been left to the private sector, and it's something you pay for. So throughout the workshop we talked a lot about the caring state and to which extent the welfare state is gone missing, to which extent the state should be present in these decision-making processes, and to what extent is the power in the private sector what makes it problematic for a caring democracy, a radically caring democracy that we were trying to talk about and envision here. There's a raised hand from Christine. Christine, please unmute and go ahead with your question.
Let's see if I can get this to work. Sorry, trying to get it on my end. Well, doesn't look like I'll be able to unmute the video, but thanks so much for having me. This is my first time actually attending this workshop, and I'm so excited to be here and to hear what folks had to say. I just had a quick question. I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we've been running a care workshop for 2 years, and we've been thinking a lot about a question that I'm wondering if you might have some thoughts on. The question we've been asking is, oftentimes we're better at care for and not necessarily care with, in the sense that care with oftentimes really makes us think about the ways that we're vulnerable, right? And so I'm wondering how we might better facilitate care with across power differentials, identity differences, even within the feminist movements today. What might we do better to be working with one another and thinking less about sort of a paternalistic caring for?
I can start off, and we should also mention that Christine just hosted, so we have 2 conference hosts present. Christine just hosted an amazing conference on care as well at Wisconsin-Madison. So I just want to publicly thank her for that again. I mean, I think, so Christine, I think this question is right on target in so many different ways. And it really, I also think, reflects a shift in certain conversations about care, right? From the origins of care ethics, which I take to be still fundamentally important, to some more recent conversations found in say, disability justice circles or trans care, those who are concerned with trans care. So one way to think about the shift from caring for to caring with, I take to be present in the language of mutual aid, right? Which is something that I'm interested in continuing to explore. And so if you take, for example, Dean Spade's work on mutual aid, there's a way in which the focus shifts from this paternalistic, how do we care for others who are in need, to how do we support one another in mutual recognition of the ways in which we both require aid, and how do we support one another in recognition of the power differentials that may hold between us, but still knowing that those who are in a position of currently experiencing need have full right to agential control and self-determination over that which they receive from others, and that to which I should say they give uptake in terms of the care that's offered. So that's just one kind of foray into thinking about the shift from caring for to caring with. And I think that the body of literature that Spade and others have been developing is quite helpful in this regard.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Spade was actually one of the readings as well in mutual aid. Actually support the current system and how certain like charity, for example, a critique of charity.
Mm-hmm.
Guillaume had to leave us. We're half an hour past our time that we planned. So I think I'll just not torture anyone any longer with the screen. All of these events are so much nicer, even when they're whole day long conferences when we're together in person. And hopefully we'll be able to do that soon again. I was saying at the beginning that I would like for everyone to keep their notes or thoughts on this, and we will try and think of something we could publish together. Our institute has a journal called Philosophy and Society. I'll send you links in my thank you email that Marco and I have planned to inform you on certain things, and thank you for everything and the time you've allocated for this. Everything that was brought up that I'm sure we were so eager and excited, both Marco and I, to comment on, that echoes our individual work, our respective works. But time already 2.5 hours. I'm happy we did what we could, and hopefully we'll have other occasions to work and talk together. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you, Marco, for doing this with me.
Yes, I mean, everything that Zona said, I fully support, of course. Thank you all for joining us and for having what I found was a really interesting and stimulating conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing it.
Yeah, thank you so much for putting this together. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much.